I'm Andy Hamilton, and I've been reading the Riddle of Father Hackett by Brenda Niall, and I'm delighted to have Brenda with us here today to talk about the book. Brenda, it's a wonderful title and a wonderful book, The Riddle of Father Hackett. Now, I suppose the riddle is, at least partly, as it seems in the book, why Father Hackett came to Australia from Ireland at a very critical time, but is there a deeper riddle for you in Father Hackett that you're exploring in this book?
I think there is, Andy. I think it's got a few levels which have been gradually working themselves out for me probably since I always knew I wanted that title. Before I'd started to write, I wanted to call it that, but I wasn't quite sure what it was all about. I think there is the riddle of why he came out of Civil War Ireland to Melbourne, to what extent was that his choice, was he sent, what had he been doing that might have led to this exile. Then I think there's the riddle of the fact that he kept silence all those years, from 1922 when he arrived till 1954 when he died, that really, so far as I can discover, nobody, even in, I would think, the close-knit Jesuit community, really knew the story, and it took a lot of puzzling over his papers for me to get close to it, and I wouldn't say I've got the whole story by any means, but I've got closer. So that was a kind of riddle for me, how someone whom I remember as a very ebullient, open, charming, relaxed man who you feel would tell you practically anything. That was my impression of him as a child and growing up, where he was a constant visitor to our house. How he could keep silent about these traumatic events in his life. That is a riddle.
Yes, and one of the things that come out in the book is just how traumatic the arrival in Australia was and his early years in Australia. One of the things I found myself wondering was that to what extent for Hackett to land in really the very macho world of an Australian boarding school at the time was particularly when throughout his life the company of women seemed to be so important to him, and so he seemed to come into his own in Australia when he really moved into a much more broader social environment, both of parish and of the Catholic library.
Yes, and well, one way of looking at that, I suppose, is that he'd grown up in a family of 9 with 3 highly intelligent sisters who often gave him a hard time, questioned whether the Jesuits were too much concerned with the upper levels of Irish social life and so on. They would argue with Willie about practically anything, and so he was very much at home with women. That was the first part of his life. Later, when he became involved in the Irish Republican movement, there were some very powerful women playing a big part there. Molly Childers, Mary McSweeney, the sister of Terence McSweeney, the Lord Mayor of Cork, and others whom he seems to have mixed with on equal terms. Another thing that's interesting about him is how easily he merged into a world that was not Catholic, Protestant, Anglo-Irish ascendancy, whatever you like to call it. And yes, Xavier would have been very, as you say, macho, I should think. Also, there was the fact that the Irish question divided Irish Australians, and he felt that coming here, he was meeting priests, Irish-born or Australian-born at Xavier, who really didn't want to know. They wanted it all to be over, and they didn't want to talk politics. Now, one would want to see it from their side as well, but that was the way he felt it.
Yes. He
said, "Mum is the word about Ireland. No one wants to know." So he was very lonely until he met Archbishop Mannix, who had already committed himself strongly to the Republican movement, and politically they would have been very much in tune with one another. And that was a big breakthrough, I think.
Yes. I was fascinated by your description of Archbishop Mannix in the various places in the book, but at one point I think you quote a writer who said that to take account of Mannix you need to take account of theatre, that there was a theatre of Mannix, and that he created himself almost as a theatrical character. And he suggested in a way that I found really resonated with me, that perhaps he became uncomfortable with that, the theatre. He fitted it too well, and so it was constricting. I wonder, did you get a sense when you were writing this book that perhaps there was a Jesuit theatre, and that Father Hackett himself, that while he lived within that theatre, there were points at which it constricted him and which he may have been uncomfortable with? So
yes, I hadn't thought of it exactly that way, but I can see what you mean, and I think that Father Hackett may have fitted himself into the role that he described. He described himself as Mannix's court jester, and maybe within the Jesuit community too, the kind of witty, sociable, irrepressible side of Hackett in which you couldn't imagine tragedy. And the sort of private writings that I read, sometimes feeling rather intrusive, suggested a great deal of self-doubt. But possibly for the Jesuits he was working with at Xavier, at any rate, and probably later, the jokes, the wit, the sending up himself, that was a kind of private theatre too.
One of the things that seemed to remain fairly steady was his vision of what was needed, and that was in Ireland for young people to be educated into Irishness, but also into a faith which was compatible with their Irish identity. And similarly in Australia, a great deal of emphasis on the education of really intelligent and gifted young men especially, to take a role in the political life of the nation. And central to that was the Catholic Library, that you have the impression that the Catholic Library was really, for Hackett, a great adventure. His adventurousness came out there.
Yes, I think that was the big achievement and the great happiness of his life in Australia, the library, and the feeling that the library worked. The library was always teetering on the edge of insolvency. He was not good with money, no one could say that, but he was good with people, and he had imagination and flair, and people came to the library to see him as well as to get books, and he ran his staff very happily. For the most part, I think there was only one clash over control later on, but for the most part, the women whom I interviewed, and I was lucky to meet several of them, they loved their time there, and they said that it was always lively. They enjoyed the company. They became friends for life. It was the kind of atmosphere which was both intellectually stimulating for the women too, as well as the young men who came to it. And in the 30s, 40s, 50s, that was not necessarily what women were led to expect.
So I found it, of your biographies, all of which I've enjoyed, this one seemed almost the most passionate. I was wondering, was there a sense in it in which you're exploring also the riddle of Brenda Niall?
I think probably all biographies question you, and this one, yes, I think you're right, Andy. It's the one I've worked hardest at, and the one which I think I found the hardest. And it did take me back to the church and the social milieu I grew up in, and I've tried to understand it.
Thank you very much, Brenda. That's for the interview, but also especially too for the book. And I hope that it gets as many readers as it deserves, which is very many readers.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Andy.
Good.